Welcome back, Curious Hearts. I'm Vera. Together, in every episode, we get to explore what it is we really believe, how we practice, and we get to meet people who are on their own spiritual path. Together, we begin. Welcome back, Curious Hearts. My name is Vera Lester, and I am a spiritual pastor. I'm a meaningful work coach. And my aim in life really is to help people make meaning of the world that we're living in and their place in it. And today in the podcast, I'm kind of excited to introduce one of the first spiritual principles. And it's the first one that I'm introducing and that I want to talk about for a lot of reasons. But the main reason is that it is deeply foundational. It's foundational to all of the other principles and really all of our practice. And that's the spiritual principle of time. So when we think about time in our day-to-day life, right? In worldly life, we think about, clock time. We think about all of these, like our schedules and our calendars and our watches, right? All of our dings. And this is, I think, one of the things that creates a sense of pressure for us in the world today. And it is one of the most important relationships that we have to reorganize and reorient in our spiritual practice and in a spiritual life. And that's because if we are so stuck in the sense of the past and the future and planning and organizing and constantly running, we miss what's right in front of us, right? And so for me, the summary of this whole concept is that existence is cyclical, right? Time, especially as it relates to our spiritual being, is cyclical. It's not linear. It's not point A to point B. It's constantly doing this. And you have to forgive me. I'm going to bring this back to your high school trigonometry class. And maybe you weren't paying attention and maybe you were not a math nerd like me, but you might remember doing like sine and cosine and tangents and blah, 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 all of those angles. And that all of that is like the relationship of the angles of a circle, right? And then this other thing happens when the circle got turned this way and it actually was a wave. And so like what's happening is we're watching this spiral, almost like a spring, right, that we're tracing moving forward. And that's how many waves work. And that's really the way that I think about time, except often it's actually our experience is a little bit more like this, right? And so as my dear friend Bear Abear says, that, man, I thought I turned a corner, but all that had happened is I'd gone around the block. And that is one of the best summaries of this. So today I'm going to give you sort of like some things to think about. We'll talk a little bit about how this shows up in our everyday life. And I'll share maybe a couple stories with you about how my relationship to time has changed. And then I want to share a little bit more about like some other traditions and what time has evolved for us. And that maybe by the end of today's episode, you'll be thinking about how you are relating to time a little bit differently. So I have two things that I sort of refer to as like real time and fake time. And it's not fake. It's invented time. It is the created time that humans have made in order to control this thing, right? Like, I think if we put numbers on it, right, then we know what it is. If we can put labels on it, if we can measure it, right? If we can't measure it, it doesn't exist. But for the vast majority of human history, like really up until, certainly, I forget now exactly when the clock was invented, but it wasn't that long ago in relative sense. But, maybe like 500 or 600 years ago. and correct me if I'm wrong, like make notes in the comments, that these the sense of time was really determined by the natural world, right? That was how we measured what was happening from moment to moment. And in that moment to moment, right? It's like the sun rises, the sunrise is the beginning of a new day, right? And a day is an actual unarguable measure of time. There is no it's not invented. And regardless of where you are in the world, like if you get very, very close up to the poles, right? The days will get shorter and shorter and longer. But there is still that sense of like, okay, and now it's dark and we're coming back again. So we already have that sense of that, right? Like the sun rises, that is sort of for us typically the beginning of a day, right? We get to the full sense of noon. It's like bright, it's like midday, we call it now, gathering down in towards the evening hours into sunset. And then things get dark and there's a sense of quiet, right? And many of us sleep in that moment. Um, So that cycle of a day is real, right? We can't argue with the cycle of the day. And just like the cycle of the day, we can't argue with the cycle of the year. So, regardless of which hemisphere, regardless of how close you are to the equator, you are still experiencing some sense of season, right? There is a time when the days are longer and it is hotter outside. And then, you get into the winter and the days are shorter and it's colder outside. And that mimics the cycle of the day, right? This like bright heat is like the like intensity of summer. Um, and then the setting down, right, is like we're beginning to transition into that one equinox. And, you're in that like cooling phase, that sort of evening phase. And then the winter is like the nighttime, right? It's like really that kind of cooling, quieting. Now, we have over the course of time as humans, we've placed things like, 6 a.m. or 5 p.m. or 9 p.m. or January or April. Now, over the course of humanity, we've done things like we put labels on those things. So, like, 6 a.m. is the morning time. It's like that's when the sun is supposed to rise, right? And 8 p.m. is the evening, and like it should be dark, and that's when we should be getting ready to go to sleep. That January is cold and dark, except that's not always true. And that's the first place where time being cyclical, I think, is really important for us to come back to, and back to the sense of like what is real time. Winter is true, whether it's happening in what we now call January or what you call July if you live in the Southern Hemisphere. But winter, that's real time. That's true. Summer is also the same way. Like summer is true. I know that for a lot of us, that seems kind of obvious, but this is an important underpinning, right? This is an important foundational concept for when we start to approach time with a spiritual lens. So I want to share with you one of my favorite repetitions, right? My favorite cyclical experiences. And that's Mardi Gras. And I live in New Orleans. You may already know that. And that New Orleans has this extraordinary thing that it does every carnival season. And carnival moves based on all sorts of things that aren't relevant for right now, but again, are invented in a lot of ways. But the sense of that springtime, because it is coming at the springtime, of like profound indulgence, celebration of life, all of this like, brightness and creativity and exploration and discovery. Like if you have never been to Mardi Gras, you may not know that it actually is like the most childlike, wondrous time. New Orleans, I think, often is misunderstood as being like naked people, right? Or like lots of debauchery. And certainly some of that happens, but mostly it is this extraordinary creative time. And my Mardi Gras, especially my Mardi Gras day, I spend with a group called the Crew of St. Anne. And every Mardi Gras, I spend a lot of time and effort and money building and creating a costume. And that costume is an expression of something that's really important to me at the time. And they're often very personal. And they're personal in a way that like I could explain it simply to somebody else. But I want to share with you the one that is probably the most profound. But the parade that I walk in, right, the St. Anne's Parade, was created by the queer community in New Orleans in the 1960s, 70s, and like late 70s, early 80s in the height of the AIDS epidemic. And it was created as a celebration of the queer community. And New Orleans has this extraordinary relationship to funerals as well. Like some people say we put the fun in funeral. And St. Anne was really a funeral processional. It was an honoring of the people who had been lost in the previous year. And the culmination of St. Anne is arriving at the river and people who have lost loved ones taking their ashes or taking memories of them and walking them down to the river and allowing the river to carry them away. So every year I have created a new costume and made a whole thing. And I had one year that was probably the height it's probably my best costume ever. It was my peak, if such a thing exists. And it was the Queen of Hearts, and it was so much fun, and there was some reasoning behind it. And then the next year, I knew I wanted to be a phoenix, and so I spent all of this time trying to construct these wings that like would expand and contract. And I have so many feathers left over still from that year, and painstakingly like creating this whole costume. And what I didn't know when the Phoenix came to me, and I didn't know why. What I didn't know when the Phoenix came to me is that in the season of that Mardi Gras, 10 days before that Mardi Gras happened, my dad died. And the energy of grief and grieving was pouring through me, and there was no escaping it. And I spent those last 10 days of Mardi Gras, like I can feel it viscerally, sewing and gluing and making and like putting so much of my heart, of my grief into those wings. And on Mardi Gras Day, being able to then display them, right, and walk the same path that all of those people had walked, and to make my way to the river and to literally like rend the feathers from me and like offer those feathers into the river. That was a cyclical experience. And because I had done it already, I was doing it again, and it was new, but it was also the same. And every year since then, this is now 6 years ago, I have taken the same route with renewed intention and energy, but that the time sort of freezes in Mardi Gras time, and it becomes like everyone agrees that we're all just right here. And we're all committing to being right here with what is. Not hanging back in the past and not like worried about the future, but just being present in the celebration of now. that is one of the most profound spiritual practices I think that there is. So every time I walk St. Anne and every time I get to the river, I offer something of my costume, of myself again. And it is an opportunity of renewal. And in this way, this is one example of why I think that ceremony flattens time and why ceremony, this is again, that time is foundational. That every time we return to that kind of ritual, every time we go to a wedding or a funeral, every time we go to a graduation, every time the Super Bowl happens, because the Super Bowl, I think, is also its own ritual. Every time we're returning to that moment, we're building a relationship with our past self and also with all of the other people and beings who have ever walked that path, who have ever celebrated that celebration, who have ever grieved that grief. And we're all returning back. And suddenly there is this eternal presence of what's happening right now. And that is, to me, one of the greatest gifts of spiritual practice. And because of that, it is also, I think, an essential principle, right? That we have to begin to develop a relationship with time that is not just linear. That our linear sense of time, for the most part, causes us a lot of distress. And I think that the other reason that this is a deeply spiritual principle is because one of the deepest human questions we have is what happens after we die. And it's no accident that every spiritual and religious tradition has their own answer for that. Because that is this like human spiritual curiosity. It's this question that lives in our heart. How did I get here? What was happening before I was here? And what will happen after I'm here? And because that before and after somehow makes what's happening in the course of our lives, it sort of bookends it so that we know, okay, like this is it. Here we are. But if we live our whole life in that sense of like, okay, I have 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, if the whole span of our lives, if I have maybe 100 years to live on this planet, sometimes, and for some of us, that can give us a real sense of preciousness of moments, which I think is useful. But it also can create a sense of scarcity. And that scarcity instills in us a sense of pressure and a fear about now all of these things that like have been running in our heads all this time, which is about like, well, I'm wasting time. Where am I spending my time? Well, how can I save time? When time is happening, right? That time is this unfolding evolution. And I think that the ways that our spiritual traditions have invited us to relate to time and to remind us about this is incredibly poignant. So, I was talking about Mardi Gras, Ash Wednesday. If you go to Mass, again, I'm not Catholic. I'm a secular Catholic. Sometimes I go to Catholic Mass because it makes me feel good. Reminds me of home. And one of the things that is said in that Mass is from ashes you came and to ashes you will return, right? Or dust to dust, ashes to ashes is sometimes, there are a couple of ways that it's said. And that reminder that like, in some ways, the ash on our forehead of Ash Wednesday is the beginning and the middle and the end all at once, right? That we are immediately reminded of how ephemeral this life is, how temporary, and being stuck in this sense of like, I have to maximize how much I can get done in this limited amount of time that I have in my life. Um, Maybe that works for some people, but I know it doesn't work for all of us. I think too that one of the other things that happens, especially in spiritual practice and especially in a healing practice, is there is this moment that we get to where we go like, "Ah, damn it, I thought I'd done this already, right? I thought I was moving forward. Um, and really I've just been moving back the whole time. And that's that drive of like being linearly pushed forward and upwards and constant like improvement and growth and expansion. And that is just not how the natural world works, unfortunately. And we are part of the natural world. But it also strips the value and the meaning of the experience that we're having right now. One of my favorite teachings in the yoga practice is about the siddhis, right? And the siddhis are these like magical yoga they're sort of magical powers that spiritual beings have, and that if you have a yoga practice, sadhana for a long, long time, that like maybe you will acquire these siddhis. And one of those siddhis is the ability to stop time. And I love that as it's like a carrot for us, right? Like if you keep practicing, you'll be able to stop time, right? You can tell that they like understood what would get people motivated. And also, I know probably if you are listening to this podcast or watching me, you have an experience already of being so present in your spiritual practice that everything seems to fall away, including that sense of time. You enter a timeless space that is both eternal and minute. And it feels a little bit like time doesn't exist and so is stopped. And there's this tremendous paradox of having to live in a world that is, we're running on deadlines and quarterly schedules and, your taxes and then Christmas and then Mardi Gras and then you got to go on vacation and school's starting. And right, we have all of these associations with different times of the year, times of day, and, measuring and all of that micromanagement of the time. That being able to step into a timeless moment where time kind of stands still like that is both revolutionary and a little scary. Because when we transcend, when we step out of that measured linear time, we feel a freedom from the restriction of it in the rest of our lives. And we find that we're maybe a little bit less willing to subject ourselves to the kind of pressure and intensity, right? And that allows us to be more at ease when we then go back into the world and to operate with a sense of what's happening right now, right? It's no coincidence that one of the most, top 10 most popular spiritual books is The Power of Now. That these are core teachings. One of the other core teachings that I think is really interesting is the notion of reincarnation. That is one of the answers to this question of what happens when we die. It's like, oh, you come back and you do it all over again, right? You like come back into a cycle of just like the sun rising and setting and just like the year and, just like the seasons and the cycles of the moon, you come back and your life returns back to the beginning again. And that too gives us a sense of freedom, maybe, and a sense of relieving the pressure of how much we have to get done in this current lifetime, because there will be more. But also we see these regenerative and cycles of renewal in nature, right? We see the cycle of water, right? The water evaporating and going up into the clouds and like building up and then, it raining or, snowing, and then the snow slowly melts, and that snow melting creates the flow of rivers, right? And that the river water comes at, right? It's like this eternal cycle. That's a much longer cycle of what's happening. This, like, we're coming back again and again to the same place. It's a cycle. It's cyclical. It is both cyclical and linear, but I think we're so more familiar with linear time that bringing our attention back to cyclical time is really important. So in practice, like in your life, what does that do for you? What does that allow us to do? Well, one of the first things and the most important thing for me is that first, right, it allows us to be released from the pressure of like, what did you accomplish at what age? Did you finish enough to justify your hours? All of that stuff. But in a broader sense, it means that when we come back around to some of these core teachings, and those core teachings often come to us in challenges. So like when we come back to a sense of grief, that every grief touches the grief that has been there before, but we're bigger, right? We've been made bigger by each layer of grief. And so we are continuing to come back to the same place, but also a little bit more expansive, right? Not advanced, but expansive. It's like the playing field got wider. Perhaps you've had the same experience, right? Where you're like, you find yourself in a relationship maybe, or in a working environment, and you're like, wait, how? I already did this, right? I already healed this thing. I already solved this. Why am I doing this again? And in those moments, we remember that like, oh, right. Oh, right. I'm going to come back again to this thing that becomes like an old friend. And then we're no longer beating ourselves up for like going back. It's like we're coming back around again with everything we already knew. And like maybe we see it a little bit differently this time. And in time, maybe through this spiritual life, we get to a place where we come back around and you're like, oh my God, how am I in the same position again? You're like, oh, look, here we are again. I've been here before. I know what it looks like to be in this kind of relationship. I know what it looks like to have this kind of boss. I know what it looks like to like have put all of this pressure on myself. I know what it looks like to pivot or change. And in time, we learn that those are the moments of our greatest growth. And so maybe even we look forward to coming back around again in the same way that I look forward to, after Ash Wednesday is done and, clean up and put everything away, I look forward to the next season of Mardi Gras, even though I'm not ready for it yet. The last thing that I will say about this in a practical sense is that when I am planning, and planning is one of the greatest paradoxes of this principle ever, because if there is only now, if now is the only real moment and everything that happened before is memory and everything that's happening, in the future, whatever that is a reverie, right? All of that is in our imagination. This is the only moment that's real. Well, why would I ever plan? What's the point of that if this is the only moment that's real? And then this one, and then this one. Why would I spend this moment thinking about that moment? That's another podcast for another day, but it's worth talking about. That when we approach that like intentional relating with our future, relating to the future is also relating to the present, first. And also, we can remember, I like to think about planning as in cycles of the seasons or in cycles of planting. And most of us are very actually separated from planting and from the agricultural world. So if this is old hat to you, then you can just fast forward about 2 minutes. So when you were running a farm, when you're growing food, there are a lot of stages to that, right? And the first stage that most of us, there are actually 2 stages that most of us aren't really familiar with. And the first is like testing the soil, making sure there are enough nutrients in the soil in order for what we are planting to grow. And so we determine like, okay, is there enough nitrogen? Is there enough phosphorus? Is there enough whatever? Is it too acidic? Is it too basic? What amendments do I need to add, right? What do I need to add to the soil to cultivate this sense of richness for something to really grow in a healthy, robust way, right? So testing the soil and adding the amendments to me is like the first step. Then we plant a seed. And if you have ever grown anything, you do not plant a seed today and tomorrow you harvest the fruit. Yet so many of us have this expectation of ourselves that like, oh, well, I'll plant this seed today and then I'll let it manifest. And in a week, then I'll get what's coming to me then. That's not how this works. There are so many stages before then. So we plant the seed, right? We plant and nurture the seed. And as the seed is sprouting, it looks like nothing is happening. So that feels important for us to remember. So then as the seed begins to push out through the ground, right, there's actually a tremendous amount of work and effort happening that we can't see. So that comes out through the ground and then you get the initial sprouts and you have to be very tender and like care for them and like thin and all of those things. And then those things start to grow, right? They start to grow, they get stronger, they get a little bit more robust. And that starts to happen actually very quickly. And even just like looking at that kind of plant from a day-to-day basis, you see that growth regularly. And it's like, oh, wow, wow, that's happening so fast. All the while here, you're probably continuing to add food and nurture and water. And you're weeding, right? You're like making sure that there isn't a whole lot of competition happening around that growth. And then you get to the flowering stage, right? And the flowering stage and the pollination stage is really important, right? Because we get this like transition, we get the communication between the male and the female parts of the plant. We get, that cross-pollination that allows for those flowers to develop into healthy, important fruits, right? Then those flowers, if we're lucky, begin to ripen. And the flowers that were beautiful start to fall away. And we see now what we have theoretically been here the whole time. We see like this fruit or vegetable or grain start to grow. We're like, okay, here it comes. Here it comes. And this is an important part of the process because often we want to jump the gun. We don't want to wait for it to ripen. And also, you have to watch most food as it grows, especially fruit foods, right? So like tomatoes or okra or cucumbers, like things that like grow and ripen, because they will over ripen and then they will spoil, right? There is this moment where it's like they're ripe for the picking. And and then we have a harvest time, right? And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, where did all this come from? There's like more okra than I can eat. I'm speaking from personal experience. And like, here's all of this, like, here is the bounty of my harvest. And that moment of bounty is a tiny fraction of the growing cycle. And it's important for us to remember that, right? that harvesting and enjoying the richness of harvest is really just a fraction of the time. So then we have this harvest. Finally, the plants start to, they've produced what they're going to produce. They start to get leggy and overgrown. And we like maybe you plow them over, maybe whatever. But in a healthy field, when we're really, my half brother is a farmer, and he told me about this incredible phrase that I love when he talks about the community of the soil, because soil is not dirt. Soil is a living, breathing thing. It's like full of all sorts of organisms and whatever. And in order for that to really richly be able to produce again, the field must lay fallow. And when the field lays fallow, it's resting, right? And all of this digestion is happening below the surface, and these exchanges, right? And like breaking down of things and integrating. But that laying fallow lasts sometimes for an entire season, right? An entire growing season. So I like to always come back to this metaphor and this teaching from the natural world that if we are always trying to speed things up or make the most of our time, we are disregarding the thing that is the most obvious, which is that we're natural living beings. And so there will be cycles of our life when we are, just fragile coming out of the ground. And there are moments when we're like growing and healthy and robust. And there will be moments when like there's so many ideas and so many opportunities popping off that it'll be almost too much for us to keep up with, right? And there will also be moments, and this is in our work life, in our romantic life, in our spiritual life, where we will need to lay fallow, where we need to allow all of the things that have happened and grown and been harvested to rest, and like whatever detritus is left behind to disintegrate and break down naturally over time before we can begin again the start of the cycle, testing the soil and seeing if it needs any adjustments. So I hope that that is a helpful metaphor for you as you're reflecting on maybe where you are in your own life right now. And remembering that there is not like there's no finish line, right? There is no we do not arrive at a place. And in fact, the invitation from our spiritual life is that we will always come back around. So is there a moment in your life right now? Is there something coming up in your life right now that has felt like, I can't believe we're doing that. I did this already. I healed this. I've had this conversation 1,000 times. Why did I do that again? And that you can give yourself the permission to allow that to be both how you're feeling, but also to allow it to be true that it is happening again. And the gift inside of this is just like our practice. When we return to the same practice over and over again, sitting for meditation or asana practice or prayer or whatever it may be, when we return to the same practice again, we realize that we have changed and how we are different. So although you may be returning back to that quote unquote same situation, or it might feel like the same situation, you are not the same as you were before. And the invitation, I think, in those moments, and my invitation to you, is to notice the ways that you have changed and that you are growing or have grown. And to begin to remind yourself that you will be here again. And so because you will be here again, how can you work with this moment, this stage in your cycle, so that you have it for the next time? And in that way, you are honoring both your linear cycles and your cyclical, right? The linear time and your cyclical time, that you will be back here again. And this cyclical experience is makes our lives really so much more full. Um, what might feel like backsliding to you today might actually be deepening. Like, what pattern that you're seeing in yourself might be a gift, maybe a gift to grow or to learn, or maybe just a gift, period. I know that the world around us is really focused on getting it done, uh, maximizing our time, being efficient, which means getting more done in less time, in expanding rapidly and going faster. And I think we feel how fast things are these days. And that speed gives us a sense like we have to keep up, right? We're going to fall behind. And I hope in those moments that you will remember that there's no such thing as behind, that somebody might be a little bit ahead of you, right, on this spiral staircase, or somebody might be a little bit behind you on the spiral staircase. But we're all coming back around again. So in that energy, I just want to offer you my deepest wish that when things come back around, you can greet them like old friends, and that you will always be willing to begin again, that we don't grieve the sun as it sets. We enjoy it, and we don't exhale a sigh of relief every morning when the sun rises. We just allow it, and let that be your inspiration for how you relate to these things that are coming back around and your own cycles of time.